obviously in jiu-jitsu, actually this is across the board of all grappling sports, judo and wrestling and jiu-jitsu, knee by far is the most commonly injured joint, like across the board.
Hello, friends. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Mayn Idea Podcast, where today I have the pleasure of sitting down once again with Mike Piekarski. If you're enjoying this show and you want to see it grow in 2024, please take 30 seconds and leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. It is so easy to do. It just helps the show tremendously with organic growth and placement. The other way that you can support the show is by simply sharing it with somebody who is interested in strength and conditioning, jiu-jitsu, and human performance. Mike Piekarski is a jiu-jitsu black belt and physical therapist, better known on social media as Doctor Kickass. He has courses available both for practitioners as well as patients, so if you want to check those out, you can see the show notes. And a quick reminder for those of you that are interested in the upcoming Rash Guard drop, if you want to be included on the email list, go to the website, www.maynideapodcast.com, and submit your email. I'm not going to spam you, but as soon as these rash guards drop, you will be the first to know. They're going to be made in a limited quantity. So if they sell out with just the email list, they're not even going to go to social media. But in the event that you want to be first dibs on that, make sure to submit your email on the website, www.maynideapodcast.com. The other way you can support the show is by checking out the show notes and supporting the sponsors. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Mike Piekarski. Well, Mike, back again for round 2. It's always fun to chat with people who actually know a thing or two about injury prevention, risk reduction, and all that kind of stuff. So I know that listeners have reached out even as frequent as yesterday with, my MRI is saying this, I have something similar to what you had. So I figured it was probably a good time to bring you back on and we can kind of field some of these questions and talk about the sport that we love to do so much, but really how to stay healthy doing it. So I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So I was actually I'm trying not to do this, but I found it's very easy to get sucked into I would even call it arguing with someone in the YouTube comments, right, on a video. And I think part of it's like you feel like you gotta say your piece a little bit, but it's like a dead end. You don't know this person. You have no idea where they are. It's almost a little addicting, right? Like you can see this happen on Reddit. So we were talking about sport, the sportiness and kind of athleticism in jiu-jitsu and whether this is like a net good thing or not. I think it's like one of the most powerful things for the growth of the sport to ever happen. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on when you have this range of people, right? Like you have people that are coming in, they got families, they got people at home, they got full-time jobs, they're fitting jiu-jitsu in after work or in between meetings, whatever it is. And then you have people that are trying to go to ADCC or compete at CJI, yet we all train in the same spot. So from your side of the tracks here on injury and recovery, what are your thoughts about how schools handle like this competitive mindset and a need to compete?
So for jiu-jitsu, I think one of the things that's interesting jiu-jitsu versus other grappling sports like judo or wrestling is I think there's a little bit less need for competing in jiu-jitsu. Like, I don't know what percentage of jiu-jitsu athletes are actually competitors. It's probably not that big. I do think there is a benefit for people who do jiu-jitsu to at least do one competition because most people are never going to be in a self-defense situation. I think one of the best things about doing a jiu-jitsu competition is can you apply your art under a stressful situation? So I think there's benefits to that. But ultimately, like if competing is not for you, like I don't think everybody should compete, and because I do think that sometimes too, like I think Chris Howder talks about how there's like sport, there's the art, and then there's the essentially he's like I'm blanking on the last
one.
Sport,
art, and street.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think there's relevance to that because I feel like sport dictates a lot of what we do because like you're not going to want to go to the gym and you're going to lose. You're like, oh, I have to learn this new technique. But I also
Right.
feel like you should just like learn the art in general. Like I was teaching um, leg entanglements, and I was talking to a guy, and I started discussing like reaping and heel hooks. He's like, "Well, why are you showing reaping if I or heel hooks if I can't do this?" He was a blue belt, and I was like,
Mhm.
because like from even from an injury prevention standpoint, like I've worked with people who go to a gym and people do the techniques whether it's legal or not in that gym. Like people will be training in the gi, somebody will heel hook them, and then they get injured. Like that wasn't legal in their training session, that the school doesn't allow it, but people still do it. So like I
Right.
feel like having the awareness is really important. And then obviously for like a street self-defense situation, like like you should be prepared to either do things or someone to do something to you, even if it's not part of what the competition will let you do under your specific belt. So already, I think that competition is important, but I don't think it's the only thing. And then you're also discussing like you have like ADCC competitors, and then you have like regular people. Like how do you handle that? And obviously, I think that's going to be more gym specific because certain gyms are going to have the sufficient population where they can have like true competition classes versus other places aren't going to have that amount of people. So you might have
Right.
like one or two competitors and they have to pretty much train with everyday people, which isn't necessarily bad because if you listen to like Hodger Gracie, I think he had moved to England and pretty much he was winning world champions primarily training with blue and purple belts. Now I'm sure that they
Right.
were good, but obviously like he's winning every black belt division, and he's not training with the same caliber people as him. So, I think it's on the athlete to learn how to train with what they have access to. Which doesn't mean like just crush every 50-year-old person with a job just because you're getting for competition. Like I can
Right.
still train with someone who's maybe they're an older person, they're not competitive. Maybe I'm training with like a young kid. I can still train in a way to get benefit without hurting them.
So this is, I agree with you fully. And I think this is something that you start to realize the longer that you've been doing jiu-jitsu. Like there's variance in intensity, of course, just like anything, but there's also advantages to training with different skill sets. Like if you're always going, 11 out of 11 with your same weight, same skill level competition prep, there's going to be limits to that training structure. And then if you're going with someone who's maybe a little bit like less skilled in certain areas, you can get off techniques that you otherwise wouldn't be able to, or work parts of your game that maybe you wouldn't take a risk on because there's you're potentially giving up a bad position or something like that. So when you think about school structure and academy structure, what do you think is like the best approach to training for these for academies that, let's say, they do have a mix of skill level and they actually have the bodies? Because like you said, some of these places are just small. Class is going to be 10 people and that's all you got. But when you have variance in skill and multiple bodies, what's the best way to keep people safe and keep them progressing?
Well, I think, and I know you just talked to like Greg Saunders recently. So obviously, when it comes to getting better at jujitsu, is different than intensity. So I think that's a
Yeah.
difference. And since I've been starting to go down the eco constraint-based learning approach, there's an important thing with motor learning versus skill. Like I don't have to go into training and just like submit everybody like a dozen times to prove that I'm better, because a lot of
Right.
times skill development, especially if it's a skill that's not your A game, so like maybe just rolling isn't even the best way to do it. Like I've been kind of thinking about, I probably introduced to like eco, I don't know, maybe 3 4 months ago or something like that, and I've been slowly getting more into it. I actually think the ecological training is probably better for injury prevention risk, and the reason why is because let's say you
Yeah.
take an eco game, right? Well, one, the intensity for the most part is going to be far less because you're working with different constraints. Two, the repercussion for losing, it might be like somebody got chest to chest. Well, that's not that bad versus, I got submitted like 17 times. Nobody wants to get submitted. So I feel like because of the winning conditions, people are a little bit more willing to play around with less intensity. And then also a lot of constraints might take out either A, positional scrambles where injuries are going to happen, or B, going to take out joint locks. So it allows you to develop a movement quality relevant to jiu-jitsu, but there's inherently less risk.
But what happens when that goes live? So
Well,
like
if you
if
think
you
about it,
train, let's say you train with these constraints
yeah,
and you limit certain joint locks and twisting and rotation that's unwanted that
yeah,
like let's say that kind of plagues white belts, and so you see two white belts scrambling with each other, they don't really know what they're doing, and then one of them's like, my knee.
yeah.
And it's really just the result of like they were not skilled enough to transition through the position based on experience, so they end up with this thing. But if you're separating into games, which I'm not convinced is a bad idea, actually I was surprised after the conversation to sit with it for a couple days and think about how I felt, which I'd love to talk to you about. But you separate out into these games, and then the games, even in themselves, because of the constraints, are isolated.
Correct.
And then you unleash to a full roll. How is that changing or not changing the person's abilities in that? Like, do they then just never end up in those positions, or is then the risk even greater because you're not experiencing like the rolls in and out of and preventions of those locks?
So I'll say so I'm slowly starting to incorporate constraint-based learning. I'm not doing like in any of the classes I teach, I'm not doing true eco where I'm just saying like I'm letting people kind of solve on their own. I'm doing more constraint-based learning to like encourage a specific pathway. So generally what I do
Gotcha.
is I will play a game with certain constraints. It might be like we'll take leg locks for example. Okay. So injury risk with submission, or for really anything in jiu-jitsu, is going to be positional or situational awareness, meaning like do they
Right.
understand the position when they're in risk? Most injuries associated with joint locks are going to happen A, with ignorance, meaning either the attacker doesn't have good braking mechanics, doesn't have good control, so they hurt their partner. B, the defender has poor understanding, so they don't recognize when they're in a bad position, or um, they don't have good defensive response, so they roll the wrong way. Then we also can take ego, right? So one, let's say you're a blue belt, you're rolling with a brown belt, and you get in with a footlock, and you're like, man, like I never tap a brown belt, so maybe you go a little bit harder. So there's that ego, right? They want to get that scalp to say they tapped a brown belt.
Right.
Or you can flip it and say, let's say you're a brown belt and you're training. I'm just saying brown belt, but like but like you're an advanced belt. Maybe you're rolling at one of those gyms that doesn't allow leg locks until a certain belt level. So even though this brown belt is an advanced grappler, there's still a novice with leg locks. So then they go
Right.
to an open mat. They go with a 10th planet blue belt. They've been training leg locks since white belt. So like even though they're only a blue belt, they're really good at leg locks. So
Yeah.
now the blue belt gets that brown belt. Well, brown belt doesn't want to tap to a blue belt, right? So, I feel like again it goes ignorance, it goes ego, and then the other thing would be lack of control. So one of the things that I talk about a lot when I teach leg locks is like back in the day, back in like the early 2000s, the most classic heel hook was going to be an outside heel hook from a reap position. Now, obviously we learn this now, but the reap is essentially controlling the same way that the leg breaks. So the only way that
Right.
I can, and then also from the reap, their defense is the roll. So now it's like they're rolling, so I have to try to break their leg before they can roll. So there's that speed of application. And then I would say that one of the things that like the Danaher Death Squad started making more apparent with leg locks is these like more intricate leg entanglement controls. So again, with my various control, I'm in a great position. I don't need to apply the leg lock super fast because they're not getting out. So that's a lot of things.
Right.
So again, we have speed of application, we have ego, and then we have ignorance. So assuming we take all those away, because there's still stuff that happens. In something like an eco or constraint-based learning, generally what it revolves around is one, can I control the limb, which is control. And if you can't control the limb, you really won't be able to finish. So if let's say I'm defending leg locks and I can make it so that my opponent can never get good control of my leg, obviously I'm safe. right? We could take situational training. So it's like, well, again, if I'm rolling with someone who's a leg locker, I can be maybe more of a smash pass, so my legs aren't available. Versus if I'm standing, all I can do, if let's say I'm playing guard against a standing opponent, all I can do sweep, stand up, or footlock because their arms, their shoulders, and their neck are way too far away. So there's that. In regard to, let's say you're with someone who's learning this, but I think if you have a healthy and learning environment where you encourage people that you tap, you give people the education on what are the repercussions with this specific submission. And then, like for me, like I'm a black belt, I tap all the time. And like in my classes, I encourage that, like, look, don't worry about tapping. Like, I don't care if, you tap to a lower belt. Like I don't get to roll with as many black belts as I get to roll with other people. So if I'm going to be in a position where I get tapped by a lower belt. And it's one of those things, like, even if I'm the instructor, I'm a black belt, like, that's the magic of jiu-jitsu. Like, it works. I can't just not tap because I don't want to. Like, so I think those are all those things. I also encourage people, especially with leg locks, is really, one, obviously, if you sound defense, obviously that's good. But two, having sound offense, because if I understand how to break a leg, I can understand how to not break a leg. I feel like it's those people who don't really understand. They're like, well, the guy isn't tapping. They don't feel it. I'm just going to go harder and harder and harder. So if you have good breaking mechanics, I think it's a little bit safer. Like, I mean, I've been doing leg locks, heel hooks since like white belt. And I think I might have only accidentally injured one person in almost 20 years. And the person admitted that it was their fault, that they had an ego and they didn't tap when they should have. So I think
so this is one of the aspects of the constraints-led approach that Greg was talking about last week that I actually thought was kind of cool, is this the control element, which you alluded to. Because if you and I are new and we do the technique of the day, and then our instructor goes, live training, and I get you in some like almost position, right? Like maybe I'm close to an RNC, but I'm not under your head. And so I just go to crank your neck because I want to get my literal stripes, right? Yes. So I do something like that, and you're not conditioned. You don't know how to defend it. We're new, and you tweak your neck super bad. Now you're out for months, or you decide you don't want to train jiu-jitsu anymore. That was the result of not understanding how to control my opponent from the back. If I had known how to control my opponent from the back and take my time and be patient with getting my hand in the right position and then safely apply the pressure, right? Maybe in a tournament, you get a neck crank and you go for it because you're trying to win, right? Now you're in an athletic setting and you're trying to win and advance to the next round. So that's a little bit out of the discussion. But in the safety of the training hall where you guys are all trying to make each other better, the advantage of learning how to just control elements of training is huge. And you know this because when you train with someone who's really skilled, I'm assuming this is a sentiment that like your students would have with you, right? How often do you get them in a position and you hold it and you make eye contact with them, kind of thing, where it's like, I could blow your kneecap out of the socket if I wanted to, but I'm not going to, because you learn that. And so when the game is such that one person is trying not to let a single thing happen and the other person is trying to definitely make that happen, it just builds a much heightened level of proprioception and control of the opponent. And ultimately, that's what's going to allow you downline to set up a better submission anyway. Yeah. So I thought that part of it was really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, it was interesting. So, I'm a black belt, so I'm fairly controlled. I was visiting a gym, and they do leg locks. So I get this one guy. I think he probably was a purple belt, but it was he was either a purple belt or a brown belt. I don't know, but it was no-gi. So I get him in an inside heel hook, and he's like done, but he didn't want to tap. And like I keep looking, but he didn't do it. So it was pretty much do I let go or do I break this guy's leg? And obviously I'm visiting a school, so there's no reason for me to hurt the guy. So I just let go. And it was interesting because his coaches were watching, and like they even told the guy, I'm like, dude, you can't do the Paulo Meow defense of just not tapping. Like they saw that he was essentially the only reason he didn't get hurt was because I had the ego where I'm like, I'm not going to hurt this guy. But not everybody's going to like right. He's going to do that.
Totally. So what are your thoughts on I'm particularly interested in your opinion of this now that I'm on this whole ecological jiu-jitsu rabbit hole, which I'm sure who knows? Maybe the audience is so over it that they don't even keep listening. But I find it interesting, especially from a coach's perspective, and its application specifically to martial arts, because I think I was trying to think of other sports where I feel like it would work really well. Something like soccer. Like, you play a lot of games in soccer when you're younger that help you develop footwork, field awareness, all that kind of stuff by happenstance, right? The game structure is such that you walk out of it with new abilities. And so I was trying to think of other places. Martial arts is a great place for this. So from your perspective, being someone that actually sees a lot of these injuries happen, you do a great job of reviewing stuff with your content, whether it's in the mixed martial arts world or in the grappling world, especially after tournaments. Whenever there's an injury, I'm kind of always jumping to your page to be like, what really happened there? What actually happened to Connor's foot when he stepped backwards? Yeah. So seeing everything that you see on your side and kind of through that lens, what is your honest reflection on this whole eco approach? It's kind of like pros and cons, things that you like adopting from it, and those that you kind of leave by the wayside.
Well, I think, to kind of fast forward, I had some friends that were kind of talking about it, and I was kind of curious. And so I'm a physical therapist, so I took a motor learning class like 10 years, even more than 10 years ago, because I was in school. So it was like 11 years ago. And this eco thing was discussed then. At the time, I was like a purple belt, so I wasn't really in a situation of like, should I try to change the way jiu-jitsu is taught? Because I wasn't teaching classes, right? So I learned about it, and motor learning doesn't matter whether it's from a physical therapy standpoint or from a jiu-jitsu standpoint. Motor learning is the same thing. But it was like kind of like I learned about it, took the motor learning class, and I remember thinking, jiu-jitsu doesn't really do things that I think are really, they're not really doing motor development correctly, but I wasn't in a situation where I could do anything about it. So then, fast forward, I'm learning a whole bunch of other stuff, and then I start learning about eco and it getting used in jiu-jitsu, and it just made a lot of sense, like, because there's certain things. Like, so I was rolling with a guy, and he's a white belt, and he's just trying to spam techniques that he knows. He doesn't know too many techniques. So he's just trying to scissor sweep me. But I'm nowhere in a situation where he needs to I was like, and one of the things I liked about with eco is it boils down like, what is my main objective of the guard? Something that Greg talks about is like the guard for the most part is distance control. So really his job should be controlling me, whether it's keeping me away or keeping me close. But he's just trying to just spam this technique. I'm like, dude, this is not going to work. That's all he knows. Versus if we just didn't even have him know the scissor sweep and all he's doing is just preventing the pass, he would have essentially responded better. So that's one thing. And I'd be rolling with my students and I gave someone a tip and they're like, I didn't even think about that. That's not taught. Because I'm like, it's not a technique that you can teach, it's a tip. And I think that's like a one thing with eco that's obviously, I think probably the most controversial, is the eco idea is as opposed to just telling people what to do, you put them in an environment to do it correctly, which makes sense. But in the same time, I do think there are things that you can kind of guide someone. So as a black belt, there's things that I know that I've learned that you can kind of filter someone to do it correctly. So there's the rote memorization versus what you can do. And I remember I was training at a gym. I was new. I was a brown belt at this gym, and there was one of the instructor's better students. He was a blue belt, and it was fascinating because he could rote memorize every technique. He remembered every detail that the instructor wanted when it comes to a technique. However, he had no ability to do it live. So he was like I don't want to make fun of him, but he was essentially a very mediocre blue belt, even though if you listen to him, you think he knows, like, wow, he knows a lot of technical jiu-jitsu, but he was nowhere close to doing it. And I think that's, obviously, like, you can drill for hours and hours and hours and know what you're supposed to do, but it's like, can you actually apply the technique? And I think that's where eco is a little bit better, because I've seen people where we drill for hours. Like, there's certain techniques that I have drilled and I've gotten nowhere close to actually doing it live, even as a black belt, because there's a component that's missing. And that's the thing, that once you get that one component, everything makes sense. Like, you take like an inverted armbar from closed guard. I learned that a blue belt never got close. Randomly, as a black belt, it started working, and I'm catching other black belts with it. And it was just, for whatever reason, it just clicked and it made sense. And it's not I need to drill this more. It was the right situation came in my head while I was doing it. And once I had success, I was like, oh, this is how I do it. And now it's one of my higher percentage techniques.
Yeah, when you are learning quote techniques, one thing that I've noticed, even up to I'm a purple belt now, you will try to you'll seek it, right? So you get because you kind of know for learning in general, right? Cognitively, in order for a skill to become, we'll say, acquired for the sake of the conversation, you learn, you see someone do it, right? Maybe your professor demonstrates, like, hey, here's an armbar from close guard. You practice it with your opponent or your partner, who maybe they're a higher belt and more skilled, and so they can teach you the nuances. Maybe they're not. You're both two idiots who don't know what's going on trying to perfect this technique you don't understand. You do that for, the professor says 5 minutes, but it's really 10 because they end up going and signing someone in who's new to the gym while you're in the middle of it. And then you get to live training and you go, if I can't make this happen in the live thing, then I'm not really going to retain it. So you seek it. And so you take let's say a 5-minute round, and the whole time you're trying to get back to that closed guard position so that you can pull the arm across your body, control their collar, sweep their leg around their head, and get this to look like the way it was represented. But if you had taken that total amount of time, let's say it's 45 minutes, and you blocked that out into little chunks where you were just trying to understand positional dominance. Greg talked a lot about this idea of emergent behavior. The behavior that would emerge out of that would be more likely what you're after anyway, but you will have learned it with variance involved. And that's one of, I think, the biggest problems with technique acquisition is that it doesn't allow for variance, because you're given a cookie cutter version of how it's supposed to go. And the reality is it is never, ever, ever like that.
Correct.
Unless the skill gap is white belt, black belt. A black belt can take pretty much any white belt, get him into closed guard, pull their arm across the body, and set up like a textbook arm triangle or arm bar. But you don't see it happening as often at the higher levels unless it's an emergent behavior. It's something that, like, situationally you create it based on factors that you don't really have the real-time ability to comprehend, because it's your autonomous action that's just happening because you've been trained in jiu-jitsu for however long you have. So I want to read and listen more about it. It sounds like I've been trying to think of areas where maybe I would disagree with the approach. And the only thing I can come up with, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this part, is I tried to use the example with Greg of like a single leg. So if you look up a single leg entry in wrestling, you could find a million diagrams, right, of exactly how this is done. I mean, there are like pretty textbook steps on what part of the leg to control, how to enter into the position, and once you have it, how to bring the opponent down to the ground. And then you look at the highest level of sports performance in the UFC. You see guys like Henry Cejudo and Mighty Mouse and Merab use exactly that, almost to a T, right? There's not even that much variance in the technique at the highest level. And so I wonder, how does the ecological approach account for something like that? Because there are technical specifics for the highest level of the athlete that's going to do them. But how do you create a game to do something like that without instruction?
So, interestingly enough, so I've, again, and I'm still relatively new with eco. So if anyone critiques me, again, I've only been playing with it for like 3 months, but perfect example. So I watched people, they would drill a single leg, and there's a few things that I realized that people, these critical details they were missing. And I can say something, so with a single, right? So people drill it correctly. And then when I watch live, one of the most common things I see is people are really, really bent over. So they're hinging at the hip, which means it's very easy for the defender to be pushing on their head. And, the person with single leg has no power. So one of the eco games that I played with, which was like which is just, all I want you to do is just hold the leg around and move your partner around. Meaning that if you have really bad posture, you're going to fatigue super fast. So it's almost like it's almost self-correcting, because they're like, if I need to hold the position and move this person, I need to have a more upright posture, head in the chest, etc. And they can kind of do that. Because I think when it comes to learning technique, there's like those key details. So if I want to get the technique, first I have to get some type of connection. From the connection, I have to get some type of like kazushi or off balancing, and then there's the finish. So they might technically know what to do, right? In jiu-jitsu, I often see when people teach takedowns, it's terrible because all they do is teach the finish, and nobody has any concept of like actual connection. So like for me, generally, if I'm going to be doing a single leg, it might be from like an underhook, same side underhook, right? So like, but people don't know that, so they're just kind of like shooting for a leg. They're in a terrible spot and they get sprawled on. So these are ways that you can kind of encourage someone to do it correctly. I might, like I said, one drill is just standing with the leg. And so then they learned, okay, I'm doing this for a minute. I have to have good posture. Then the next thing you do is I'm just getting them to step, because the more that they step, the more easy it's going to get them to off balance, because eventually you get to the point where if they cannot use their step to regain their balance, they fall over, which is already the goal. So you're kind of using those components, which is needed for a successful technique, but you just break it up so they learn the value, and then you put them in some type of live environment. And then the real argument is, where do you get better motor retention versus performance? Because a lot of times, like, I can show someone, I can tell them, giving them intrinsic cues, do this, do that, and then it looks better within the session. Then the next time I see them, it looks terrible again. When I want them to look good tomorrow, even if they look okay today. That's the difference.
How would you, given your understanding of research and valuable research and good data versus just BS research and bad data, how would you structure something to actually test the efficacy of this approach? Because I think in theory and idea, and so far in practice as I understand it, it actually does make a lot of sense for skill acquisition, like to become proficient at these different elements, and you're going to develop a lot of control with it, which is a super important part for jiu-jitsu. But I think the easy rebuttal, the super cheap rebuttal, is, well, then show me an ecological approach world champion, right? Or show, where are the people win all the medals, which is like, it's not the best argument, because it's a nuanced approach, right? It hasn't been around for. The Gracies weren't doing ecological jiu-jitsu, or maybe they were, and they weren't even calling it that, right? Yeah. But how could you structure something to like prove it, to basically be able to show schools or professors or teachers that are like late to adopt it, like, hey, this really does work. This isn't just like a couple of people were like bored with jiu-jitsu and so they started throwing big words at it, but this is effective, and your athletes are going to be better, and your non-athletes that are showing up frequently and putting in time and effort, they're also going to improve, and then as a whole your school improves. How could you conduct something like that?
Yeah, I mean, from a research, I think it'd be kind of tricky, right? But I mean, you could take two groups. One where you do the traditional teaching method. One you could do the ecological. You do some type of likely 12 weeks, because I think research shows that motor learning is going to take a while. And then you can kind of break them up into like maybe like positional roles and see like what techniques are emerging. I mean, obviously there's things you can't consider. Some people are going to be better athletes than others. You take someone like perfect example with Gordon Ryan. Like, Gordon Ryan was probably going to be great even without Danaher, right? So it's like, obviously Danaher's going to get a lot of the credit because, Gordon Ryan's the best grappler currently, best jiu-jitsu grappler, no-gi currently. But, like, he was probably always going to be good. So how much of that was Danaher's approach versus him just being really good? And that's why it's tricky, So, like I said, have two groups of people. And I wouldn't necessarily do rolling. I would do like positional training and seeing like what techniques are being done. Like, can people actually pull off these techniques versus, where they're struggling. But, it's going to be tricky with some jiu-jitsu.
With this eco approach and injury. So my cervical issue that I ended up in the ER for was really the result of, initially it was a bad takedown attempt like a year and a half prior. The series of events was bad takedown attempt, shot on an opponent, kind of caught the corner of their hip, but also caught the wall of the mats. And that was, I had extension and rotation.
Yep.
Right.
So it's like a stinger typically.
Exactly. So originally it was a stinger. I was a bonehead. If I had just given it probably like a couple of weeks off and let the referred pain in my arm go away completely, let full strength return, and then go back to the mats, might not never have dealt with the issue. Then 8 months later in a tournament, first match that I then went on to have 4 matches. The first one shot a takedown, and you can see in the video, like I ripped their gi up and drop down to shoot in for a double. I get it, but in the process, same thing. Head goes back, snaps like this, and then didn't respect it, right? Like iced it, did some dumb stuff. And this is coming from someone who has a career as a coach, right? Like I advise clients on like, do the right thing, go see the PT. I'm not eating my own medicine. Yeah. And then I just had a training session, maybe 9 months after that, and it had nagged a little bit. So the referred pain was still down into the tricep, through the forearm, a little bit of tingling in the fingers, but it wasn't excessive. And I went to a training session, no gi. It was great. I came home on like, it was the day before Valentine's Day this year. And then Valentine's Day, I was like hunched over on the ground, 10 out of 10 pain. Oh, wow. Icy, like hot pain through my arm, 0 strength in the tricep. Anyway, it ends up in the ER. And I look back on that time and I'm like, this was a live roll, right? A live training session, stand up, no gi, with an opponent who was more skilled than I was. And I don't say that at all to blame them. This was my fault 100%. But my stand-up abilities are poor relative to like someone who spent their whole childhood wrestling, right? I'm late to the game. Yeah. And I wonder, does this approach do a better job in your eyes of protecting people against the potential for stupid injuries like this? Had I, in my head, I just thought through it over the last couple of days, and I'm like, wow, I wonder if I had spent more time in these entry-exit games and control games to where I would just have better body awareness and like not shot like that and made a stupid, leading with my head thing that, wasn't caught by professors and teachers and stuff in the build up to it. So do these games and approaches have a better ability of reducing the risk of injury for athletes of all skill levels?
Yeah. I mean, I think what actually, and this is something I touched on early, which I think when we started going down this eco road, but I definitely think that eco, because of the nature, now they're still intense, but I find that they're going to be less intense, and there's going to be essentially with the right constraints, you can take out things. So people are a little bit more playful. So it's like you can try something and you fail. It's not like I have to get this takedown or I want to submit this dude. So I do, obviously, if the game is constructed correctly, that's obviously the key. But I think it's a little bit better for teaching people to do things properly in a live training. And then with that, I feel that it does have less injury risk. Again, this is just me thinking about it. This is all theoretical. We can't really prove this. But I definitely think that there's definitely less injury risk than just going live. Now, I still use live training, but usually how I would do it is I would take something, I would do very constraints, I would do like maybe less constraints, and then I would remove all the constraints. That's usually how I do things. This way we kind of get closer and closer and closer. So to your question, yes, I do think that this eco approach might have been a better way to kind of like learn the proper stand-up skills as opposed to just shooting.
So this is a stupid, admittedly kind of stupid addition to that question, but does this then make like weak jiu-jitsu players mentally, physically? Like I feel like with all of this stuff, it's kind of like the Max Holloway comes out and he's like, yeah, I don't even hard spar anymore, right? And look at the guy. He can go have absolute wars in the center of the octagon and create the most viral moment of the year. And the guy doesn't really spar hard to protect his brain. But there's people that argue like, that just makes weaker fighters. Part of fighting, part of martial arts is you are birthed out of the fire, right? You spend the first, 2 years just getting absolutely crushed by the other people in the academy that are more skilled than you, that are higher ranked than you. And it's almost like it's like a weird fraternization in the sport where like you got to get through that point, right, to get on the other side of it. Yeah. So if we take into account these games and start to apply them, do you think that that starts to affect the end product of the jiu-jitsu player? And does that matter?
No, because I mean, people are still going to do live training. It just maybe you're learning different things. Like perfect example with the double leg, maybe you with the right game you would have had better connection. From the better connection, you'd have a better setup to off balance.
Yes.
So like I said, I've been experimenting with eco and constraint-based learning. I still include plenty of live training. So I think that's the risk, right? Is that live training is where you get that like toughness thing that I think you're discussing. But then the
Yeah.
key thing is what's more important, toughness versus skill development, and I think that's the trick, because I would say that for the most part, I am not a great motor learner. It took me 12 or 13 years to get my black belt. Um, and I think partly, if looking back, it was because I was focused too much on just rolling hard versus actually trying to get better at skill, right? I had the wrong idea. I want to tap this person, not get better at this move. Um,
Yeah.
I was, it was very interesting. Like I look back, I was like a blue belt, and there was a guy who started after me, and he ended up getting better than me. And I was always curious, like, what did he do to get better? Because we trained just as hard. And one of the things that would happen was that, like, my coach would show me something, and I would try to copy everything that my coach said. Versus this other guy was much more of a free thinker. So he would kind of like goes, and he kind of developed his own style, and he got better. And looking back now, I think having that more active learning approach was better for his skill development versus just being a soldier, just doing what you're told. And
Right.
if you look at the people who, I have a buddy, he got his black belt in 5 or 6 years. He just medaled at black belt at, American National. So like, he got his black belt fast, but he's winning. And one of the things that he did to get better was he was such an active learner. Like he would go to class, he would learn what the instructor showed, but then he would be just researching things directly related to what he wanted to get better at. And he got better. I mean, he's also like obsessive, but he got better very quickly because he was the active learner.
Yeah. I feel like jiu-jitsu's grown a lot even in the last 5 years,
Yeah.
5+ years that I've been doing it. But it's exciting to see, even to have conversations about this. They almost feel like a little in the weeds sometimes, like we're talking about splitting hairs here on how to improve things. But at the same time, it's exciting because the sport's growing. It's becoming more and more of a spectacle, and the talent on the floor level is increasing. So we're only kind of in store for even more exciting, better matches, emerging stars. And part of that is coaching. I mean, as things get bigger, the training improves, right? Every sport ever has done this. As more money, more eyes, and a bigger audience join, you invest more in the players. And so you invest more in the processes that develop them and get them ready for the arena. And it's going to be exciting. I mean, as these athletes just become better and better and better.
Yeah.
I wonder just, what injuries will we see continually in this sport? Like what in your eyes, what are the most common injury that you see? It's got to be knee injuries or ankle injuries?
So we'll talk primarily about grappling because obviously we can keep going. But obviously in jiu-jitsu,
Yeah.
by far, actually, this is across the board of all grappling sports, judo and wrestling and jiu-jitsu, knee by far is the most commonly injured joint, like across the board. And I think one is it's just the nature of grappling where the knee doesn't bend in a certain way, so stuff happens. And then with jiu-jitsu you can add joint locks, etc. But it doesn't matter whether it's takedowns, positional scrambles, or joint locks. The knee is by far the most commonly injured joint. Followed by, depending on how you look for jiu-jitsu, the next one overall is shoulder. But if you look at the injuries in competition, it's an elbow. The primary mechanism for an elbow injury is going to be posting wrong, like you're trying to not fall down, or an armbar.
Yeah. Like people falling back and they lean back and their hand goes.
Yeah, proper fall. And that's an interesting thing with injury risk that I discussed. So a lot of times in jiu-jitsu, because depending on where you go, but there's gyms that they literally do absolutely zero takedowns, which I think is a mistake.
Correct.
And I think partly partly a big issue is now you have an athlete who is very poor awareness of takedowns. They don't get to train it very much, or they do it's very little. So now they have very bad defensive, responses too. And then they go to a tournament. Well, in a tournament, you're going to be standing. And it's funny. I remember I chaired the guy. He did like no takedown training, and I was watching one of his competitions, and it's like 80% on your feet. I'm like, what are you doing? You don't even train takedowns, man. Come on, like. So I think what a lot of times what people do is like, well, I can get hurt doing takedowns, so I'm just going to not do takedowns to avoid the injury risk. But again, now you're a novice in that skill set. Like, it's very interesting for me. So I'm a black belt, right? I don't have a black belt in takedowns. When I'm teaching, I still want to include takedowns. So for me, there's that that dilemma of like, should I even show a takedown if I'm showing it incorrectly? Anything that I show, like I'm being very specific on what I show to make sure I'm showing something correctly. But there's a lot of stuff that I know I shouldn't teach, so I don't teach just because I'm not a black belt in it.
Yeah, I think with technique, specifically with takedowns, like there's a little bit of that imposter syndrome is like, do I know enough to teach this? And to your point, you stick to what you do know. I mean, there's very basic levels of certain takedowns that maybe you could become proficient in and then implement those into your academy. But I think a big problem is a lot of professors at the higher end of the jiu-jitsu pedigree that have been around a long time don't have wrestling backgrounds or judo backgrounds. And that's really like good takedown mechanics, smart takedowns, safe takedowns. They come from people that understand wrestling, and they come from people that understand judo. And if you know those things, that's one thing. An ability to then teach them safely to a group of people, that's a whole nother bag. And that's part of the problem. It's teaching things properly is hard. It's just a challenge, right? Not every professor is a great communicator. And in many cases, they own their academy. They've been doing this their whole life, and they totally deserve that. But there's a difference between a professor and then like a coach.
Yes.
And that's a hard thing to navigate, because you're exactly right. That person then goes out in the world. You go to open mat somewhere and they're doing, 2-minute rounds of stand up before they do live rolling. And now you're a fish out of water, but you don't really want to say that you don't know what you're doing because you're a blue belt or something. And so you do it anyway. And then the risk goes up.
Yeah.
So with the knee injury stuff, I know, firsthand several people just here locally that have dealt with pretty bad knee injuries, like sidelining knee injuries, ACL, MCL, LCL. There's some degree to injury that is just acute, right? Like it's luck of the draw. It's you had a strong neck and you trained your neck in rotation and in isometrics and flexion and extension. You do your stretches, everything. And then some guy who's got 40 pounds on you lands on your head weird, and bam, there it goes, right? So for this sake of the question here, we can exclude these kind of acute random things that are out of our control. But what are like the best things that people can do to hedge their bets on knee injury and help reduce that risk off the mats?
So 2 things, like I said, positional awareness, positional situational awareness, and then training the actual knee joint itself. So positional awareness is understanding where knee injuries are supposed to happen, more than just, takedowns, I should avoid takedowns. You should know what takedowns are more at risk. Obviously there's like high risk techniques like jumping guards, a high risk technique of injuring your training partner, the kanabasami, the scissor takedown, any type of takedown where there's falling body weight, they're all high risk. So that's like a big thing from a teacher perspective of things I kind of talk about. Another big thing is like how you defend. Like sometimes people are a little bit too willing, like they're not willing to concede the takedown even in training, and then they get injured in that sense. So like those are the type of things of knowing where and when these injuries happen. So that being said, that's going to be probably your best way to prevent injury. But now we can talk about injury mitigation. So you take the knee joint itself, right? So the knee has 2 degrees of freedom, means it bends and it straightens, but it also rotates. Now, I'm actually writing a paper on this, but like connective tissue responds to stress. And this is more seen in obviously the rehabilitation standpoint where people have a ligament or connective tissue injury. Well, these ligament injuries, as your body heals, just because it doesn't hurt doesn't mean that the knee is healed. It just means that it doesn't hurt. Healing ligament tissue is still fundamentally weak. So essentially scar tissue is weaker, it's more lax, it's easier to break. How do you get the ligament to regain the resilience it had pre-injury? It's appropriate loading. So for me, in addition to doing like strength training, which can or can't help, and you have to think that strength training specifically will reduce overuse injuries. But having like a strong quad or strong hamstring isn't necessarily going to make a significant difference, because you have to think, if you have a maximal strength contraction that can take, I don't know, 200 milliseconds, but most sporting injuries happen in like 30, 40 milliseconds. It doesn't matter how strong you are, because you can't contract the muscle enough to resist the force. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's basically like an example would be, you got someone, they have no problem squatting 225 pounds, they can control it, they could do squats to a box and stand up powerfully, but the time it takes for that knee to go through the full range of flexion and extension to perform the exercise when they're live training, it's so fast that the actual quad muscle and the hamstrings and supporting muscles can't fire to prevent flexion or extension or mitigate rotation, and so that's what's causing the injury.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So,
and this is to build on that. I mean, it's people that I'm thinking of in my head. A lot of it's like, I don't understand. I'm strength training so frequently, and I know that I'm, quote, strong. I can't believe it happened.
Yeah.
It's
so
like,
yeah, if the just gets like, can't get wrong strong motto worked, then strong people wouldn't get injured. That obviously is not the case, right? You look at Gordon Ryan, he's pretty jacked. He tore his LCL. You take, Andre Govau, he went into ADCC with the torn ACL. So these are strong dudes. So it's not like just get stronger is necessarily enough. You can strengthen connective tissue. So generally what I do, and this is never done, is, and this is a concept I got from functional range systems, but when I include knee training, is I want to train knee rotation. So that's a thing that almost is never trained. Because generally when people are doing is they're just doing bilateral sagittal plane movements. But injuries don't happen in the sagittal plane for grappling. They're going to happen in the frontal plane where the knee doesn't bend, or rotation. So these are ways that I know that if I do like end range isometrics, I can start to initiate the strengthening process for ligament and connective tissue. Now the big thing is, how does this actually transfer to a injury reduction risk? That research doesn't exist. But if I can train active range of motion in rotation, well, obviously as my knee's moving in the frontal plane, before it moves in the frontal plane, it's going to rotate. So if I have more rotational capacity, that gives me maybe a slight buffer of maybe I can move, or etc. Two, by training that rotational capacity, I'm loading the. Say that again.
So does this contradict the mobile stable joint by joint theory, the Greg Cook theory, where like your ankle is a mobile joint, your knee is stable, your hip is mobile, and I think about that, and I think about the flexion and extension in the knee joint. When I'm having a tough time, I can picture rotation in that, like, if I plant my foot, right, and I create like torque, I can kind of see in my head that like the patella might start to rotate even though the ankle's fixed.
Yeah.
And an extreme version of that would be bad, right? We see that, and someone's got someone's ankle and they try to rotate out of it. The ankle stays, the knee rotates past its capacity and then does that. So when you're training, maybe you can explain a little bit more how to train rotation in your knee.
So generally, if I'm training, I always initiate rotational training in like a sitting position. So I can use something called a controlled articular rotation. When I do my isometric training, I'll do it. Generally, I want the knee bent to about 90 degrees because that's where you have the most rotational capacity. Generally, as you start to get more straightening, you lose rotational movement. So what's happening is, especially around 10 or 15 degrees of knee extension, now what's happening is the knee, the tibia, is going to externally rotate into the femur. It's called the screw home mechanism. So that's when the knee is fully locked, you can no longer rotate it. So if you ever watch people do a heel hook, you need some slight knee bend because the knee has the least rotational capacity, about 10 or 15 degrees, which generally is where most sporting injuries also occur, is that 10 or 15 degrees.
And this
Uh,
is not coming from the femur. I'm sitting here in my chair right now, and I'm
yeah.
trying to like my knees at 90 degrees, and I'm trying to rotate, but I feel like all of that rotation, it feels like it's just coming from my femur. Is it not?
No, it shouldn't. So what you want to do, what you can do
That's
right now, and
interesting.
anyone who wants, is I want you to so you're sitting at 90 degrees. I want you to kind of like dorsiflex your ankle, so you lift your ankle but push your heel in the ground.
Yep.
And if you feel like you can't do it without doing it, you even could put your hands between your legs so your femur doesn't move. All I want you to do is just try to rotate your shin away from you, and then you can rotate back.
Oh, wow. Got
Yeah.
you. So, for those listening, the femur is locked now
Yeah.
because I put my hands in between my legs, like you said.
Yeah.
So there's no shift. And then dorsiflex, my toes come off the ground, drive the heel into the ground, and
Yeah.
rotate. And that's coming from the knee joint via the tibia and fibula.
Yeah. So
Fibula.
so I gave you what's called passive blocking, meaning
Yeah.
you don't have the motor control awareness to dissociate your knee, so you're compensating either by moving your hip or compensating by moving your ankle. So when I put you in those positions where your ankle and your hip can't move, the only thing that can move is your knee. So generally, if I'm working with a client,
Right.
I start with these motor control exercises to like learn how to rotate, because most people I say rotate your knee, you're gonna be like, what the hell are you talking about? The knee doesn't rotate. So
It's
from
exactly how I
there,
just felt.
yeah. So once I teach someone how to rotate, then I would do like an end range isometric, whether it's an external or internal range of motion. So I like using long length isometrics specifically. So what you could do is you could externally rotate your tibia on your femur. And then what I would do is I would do essentially almost like I'm trying to heel hook myself, where I would try to internally rotate from that lengthened position.
Yeah.
And then by isometrics, that allows me to subjectively ramp up the intensity. So early on, if somebody has poor awareness, they've never trained this, or they're coming back from an injury, I keep the subjective isometric intensity very low because the
Gotcha.
knee joint has never been trained. It doesn't know how to do this. Maybe there's an injury. As we get out of the rehab phase and we're in more of the strength and conditioning phase, we want to really ramp up that intensity anywhere from that 60 to 80% max contraction. Because I mean, if you look at the literature, pretty much for training, like we really need to ramp the intensity. So I can do like an 80% isometric ramping to get a physiological adaptation in the knee, but
Right.
the intensity has to be there.
So if you're doing something like, let's say you have a client and you help them build this understanding, this motor control of their of knee rotation, which, despite again, I mean, been an athlete since I was 9 and doing this as a career for 12 years, I just felt that for the first time.
Yeah.
With that, I can really actually feel like, oh wow, there is some rotation going on in this
Yeah.
joint, which is kind of blowing my mind right now. But that's beside the point. So if I take my foot and from the seated position, and I dorsiflex my foot again and attach a light band resistance
Yeah.
to my ankle, like to my toes, and attach that to something that's hooked up laterally from me and rotate against that, is that a way to ratchet up this intensity a little bit? Because
Sure.
now I'm doing that rotation, but I'm doing it against resistance, or
Sure.
I can go out and then eccentrically control it back to the start position, like that type of thing.
Yep, absolutely. So generally, when it comes to resistance, right, we can take there's like four types of resistance. So there's an internal resistance, which would be the isometric, which is me internally controlling my body. Then we can take external resistance, which either can be a fixed resistance like a weight. We can take a band, which is a variable resistance, meaning that depending on the position of the band, it'll either be stronger or weaker. Or I can even do a manual resistance. So when I'm working in person with my clients, when I'm introducing eccentric loading, so I'm really eccentrically training I like to start with manual resistance because I can control. So everyone's going to be strong in their mid range. They're going to be weaker at their end ranges. So that allows
Right.
me to kind of modulate. While they're strong, I go strong. And then as they get weaker, I can go a little bit less. I've
Gotcha.
experimented doing eccentrically focused training with these rotations with a fixed weight, but I've decided I don't like it as much because they're like in that mid range, like I'm really strong, and then I get close to the end range, they're getting weaker, and obviously if they can't control that end range, that's where injury occurs. So when I'm doing like very focused eccentric training to their end range, um, variable resistance or band is beneficial because the band is strong while they're strong, and then the band gets weaker as they get weaker. So it's almost a
Gotcha.
way that I can modulate without having to physically be there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually, because
Mm.
as you rotate away, the band loses that. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and that'll build the. It's a jumbled way of me
yeah,
seeing this in my head in real time and trying to speak it back,
yeah.
but
You're
that
good.
makes a lot of sense. And
Yeah,
then when you say manual, like you can physically do like a PNF stretch
yeah,
or a version of that, right, where you're holding the person's
yeah.
dorsiflex foot, saying, resist against me pulling,
Yes.
and you get back to the start. You do that as
Yeah,
fatigue falls off. And
yeah, yeah.
so, what are your thoughts on like deceleration and jump training and stuff like that for the knee joint in conjunction with this kind of stuff? Let's say, assuming someone is currently healthy, they're not coming off of a specific injury, and they're just looking to ramp up their prehab, basically.
Well, then you can. So we have a question: if you're a jiu-jitsu guy, do you need to be a good jumper?
I would say so. On the question, no. Like,
Yes.
how much
Yeah.
of your time do you spend jumping unless you're a guard
Yeah.
jumper? And again,
Right.
we go
Yeah.
back to the fact that that's a
Yeah.
high risk maneuver. It doesn't pay
Yeah.
out. But I would say, you and I are in a wrestling exchange, right? And you get an underhook and you start to push back on me. That motion of like picking my foot up, receiving your weight with my weight, and planting is similar to, stepping off a 6-inch box and decelerating into a, flex position. It's not identical, but in my head, there's some transferability there. Am I off the mark?
No, 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 no. I'm just obviously I asked you a question to make a point. Like uh, most jujitsu people that I find, and maybe this is going to change. A lot of jujitsu athletes are very poor athletes, and if they don't have a history of doing field sports, like they might be terrible jumpers. Like for me, I am not a good jumper, right? And then the argument is, do you need to jump for jiu-jitsu? And I would say for the most part, no. Jumping is an expression of power, so I think it's an easy way to teach someone force develop, like rate of force development. So in that case, it's easy to do. You don't need equipment. Um, so for me, even if you don't need to, especially if I'm working with someone, so there's a lot of return to sport tests which involve jumping. Well, I can't have someone do a jump if they don't know how to jump. So I will spend some effort teaching them, deceleration and
Like
jumping.
landing?
Yeah, I mean, you
Yeah.
just if they're gonna do it, I have to teach them because if I say go jump and they have terrible mechanics and they hurt themselves, obviously that's
Right.
on me. So I do teach it because, like I said, I'm going to use that for some testing. I do think that jumping can be a usable technique for developing rate of force development. Um, but obviously, it depends on, you know, the person, their goals, etc.
I saw you get in a sweet little battle with these Anaconda knee wrap guys
Yeah.
online. And now that we're on the topic of knees and how to care for them, how to prevent injury to the best of our abilities, things that we should be doing, can you just briefly touch on knees, knee wraps, equipment for the knees?
Yeah.
Like, it's so common in any academy, right? You're
Yeah.
going to see everyone getting ready, and everyone's like pulling up their knee sleeves, and they range from very soft, malleable cotton knee sleeves up to like Ray Brand Olympic weightlifting squat type
Yeah.
knee support. What are those doing for us? Are they helping us? Are they hurting us? Are they limiting our ability? Like, what's kind of your bird's eye view on knee wraps or wrapping? And then if you have the energy, just hone in on the Anaconda thing, because I'd love to
Sure.
hear your piece there.
Yeah. So obviously, why is someone going to wear a knee brace? So one, does it enhance stability? Two, does it enhance proprioception? Three, does it? I'm trying to think what else. Does it enhance maybe patellofemoral stability? Or three, does it give awareness? So ultimately, oh, and then five, does this by theoretically enhancing proprioception and stability, does it actually reduce risk? So most of the literature that I've looked at for knee injuries associated with like knee braces is going to be more field based. But I also think that like those are sports where there's still a high amount of knee injuries. So specifically, most of the research I've looked at was football. If someone's coming back from an injury or prophylactically, does a knee brace help reduce injury? Everything that I've found is the answer is no. Okay. Second, does a brace actually help proprioception? So does it give you better awareness? Again, every research that I found is it doesn't actually help proprioception. We can look at stability. So the two reasons I would consider someone being okay with wearing a knee sleeve in some capacity is one is it gives their training part a little bit better awareness. So you're coming back from a knee injury. They see the knee brace. Maybe they're going to be a little bit more aware and they're not going to crank their knee. That's probably the one of the more valuable reasons for it. I still don't like it because just get better training partners. I also was rolling with a guy. I was pissed because I was rolling with a guy and he had a knee brace. We got in a leg lock embattlement. I literally specifically didn't footlock him and then he footlocked me. I'm like, dude, why are you wearing a knee brace? He's like, I just do it to make me feel better. And I was like, so then after that point, I was pissed because I didn't footlock him because I thought he had an injury. Anyway.
Yeah. Egoless Mike, angry that he didn't defeat his foe.
Yeah. So then another thing we can look at, which actually I do think has some relevance, is knee padding. So like, let's say you're doing a lot of shots. Does it reduce the force of a shot? I think there's something there. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of wrestlers will do it, especially if they're shooting. And then the last would be patellofemoral stability. Now, this one actually means a lot to me because I, growing up, had severe patellofemoral instability. So my knee kept dislocated. I don't know. I say dislocated. It subluxed, I don't know, like 6 or 7 times. I needed a surgery to correct that kind of failed. So like for my first 5 years of jiu-jitsu, I routinely would wear these patellofemoral braces and I would not train without them for 5 years. I'm like, if I don't wear a brace, I can't train jiu-jitsu. So I was getting ready to fight. I was fighting in Pennsylvania. It was an amateur fight. Well, so these are based on the state athletic commissions. Well, in the state athletic commission, you were not allowed to use any external brace. So meaning I have only trained with knee braces. I'm about to walk into the cage and then the athletic commission's like, you can't fight with that. So I was like, well, am I just not going to fight? So I take the braces off and I win. And I was like, you know what? If I can fight MMA and my knees are fine, I could probably do jiu-jitsu. And, and then also like this was before as a physical therapist. So like I didn't have a good strength and conditioning. I've had no issues with my patellofemoral issues since then. Pretty much after that fight, I took the braces off and never needed them.
So this actually brings me to my next question on this is because that to me, there's a psychological component there, right? Like absolutely. You walk in, they go, hey, you can't wear those. Your brain's like, oh man, I've only trained in these ever. Yeah. Confidence is low. Bam, you dominate. You're like, oh, self-efficacy through the roof. All of a sudden, I don't even think I need these anymore, right? Forrest Gump runs without the braces, and all of a sudden he's fine. Yeah. So I wonder, like, is there a psychological component to this that's a lot harder to study, wherein someone's like, my knee's kind of nagging. They put on this sleeve, whatever, maybe it has no effect, but now they believe that they're more stable, and their opponent, like you said, sees it. So then there's potentially that conversation like, oh, what happened? Hey, I'm kind of nursing a knee injury. If you get my heel, can you not rip it through the joint? But then they believe that they're better, and so they actually end up performing better.
Yeah. So I think there is that short-term psychological, maybe someone's coming back from injury, and it gives that psychological comfort. Mm-hmm. If that helps them train, cool. My problem is which is where the anaconda brace, thing came in, is when someone should not be on the mat, but they think, okay, well, I shouldn't be on the mat, but if I put the brace on, maybe I can get on the mat. So My whole thing with anaconda is they put an ad, which they're like, I just had ACL surgery a month ago. I put the brace on and I'm back to jiu-jitsu. So the return to sport for an ACL injury is 9 months.
9 months.
Yeah.
9 months?
It's 9 months. Now, I might be doing modified training from 6 to 9 months, but for the most part, 9 months is when you're good. And even though people are like, man, I do jiu-jitsu, I've been back sooner. You should not have been back sooner. There's so much research that for every month that you delay return to sport from month 6 to month 9, your like re-tear rate drops like 50%. It's like significant.
Yeah.
The ACL pretty much has around 9 months. The re-tear rates have pretty much plateaued, but that ligament to regain resilience it was pre-injury could be anywhere from 1 to 2 years. So
Jeez.
you have to even at 9 months, your ACL is still weaker than it was. So
Sometimes I'll say people are on the bats and they're like, "Oh yeah," and I'm like, "Wait, didn't weren't you like out with an injury?" And they're like, "Yeah, just trying to figure it out." And I'm like,
yeah, it's
"Bro, what on earth are you doing?" Like, even on that timeline, a 9 month timeline, you're feeling pretty good at like 5 months. Like
right,
you're happy that you're
right,
upright. You're
yeah,
the pains of the injury, the moment it happened, all the depression that people feel when they look ahead at all the stuff that they're not going to be able to do, all that's behind you. You still got 4 months.
yeah,
You're not ready
yeah.
to do it, especially in a sport that is as unpredictable as martial
Yeah.
arts.
And this is the thing that people don't think. They're like, okay, I just had knee surgery, I just had ACL surgery. I feel strong. My mobility's good. I don't have pain. I'm ready for sport. But the reason why you're not is because that ligament is still weak and vulnerable. So when it's put in any of those uncontrolled positions, it doesn't have the resilience. It's most likely to tear it. If you were to look at it, and the reason why I'm going to look more at mixed martial arts, because mixed martial arts is obviously people who make money, right?
Right.
Jiu-jitsu, because people don't have money, they tend to be honestly just dumber. So you take, there's two very prominent fighters. You have Dominic Cruz and you have Kevin Lee. I guarantee both of those people that have had a very bad history of knee injuries went back to training too soon. Guaranteed. Now,
Both of them. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean Kevin Lee's career was destroyed essentially.
destroyed. Yeah, so that was I wanted to do a post, but I don't think I'll be able to get it all in one post. But Kevin Lee's a good example. He had his fight with Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira, there was one point he had him in a heel hook, and one point he had him in a knee reap. But Kevin Lee pretty much just ignores that he's in this position. He's trying to punch himself through.
I
So
remember it.
likely he tore his own ACL.
Right.
So tears his ACL, gets surgery. Somehow, 3 months later, he re-tears it, which, in my opinion, is he likely did too much, but he doesn't realize it. I think there was like an interview. He's like, "I'm going to be back to the octagon in 6 months," which obviously he wasn't. He ended up tearing his other ACL, and I think he had a partial tear on the first one. So pretty much after that, his career was over, right? Now with the performance, the UFC PI, so now every UFC fighter has access to Heather Linden, who's a high level
Yep.
sports physical therapist. If you look at these UFC fighters, you take someone Tom Aspinall, Aspen Ladd, you have Josh Emmett. All of
Yep.
these people did not get back to fighting till a year or year and a half. Why
Right.
are they taking longer than jiu-jitsu? I think it's because their athletes have access to good medical care who realize like in like you know these people are making hundreds of thousands of dollars. So like
Right.
they can't go in and just like wing the rehab. Like they take it super seriously where Heather's going to be very specific on now you can get back to stuff. Where like you have someone like Ethan Krellenstein and he posts this, he had an ACL surgery and then like 5 months later, you see him rolling with Craig Jones, and Craig Jones does this like horrible foot sweep. I'm like, oh my god. So for me, the big thing there is, let's say you're a jiu-jitsu athlete, and you're like, well, Ethan got back after 5 months. I just had ACL surgery. I could be back. And the case is no. You look at what MMA fighters who are real athletes who make a lot of money, what are they doing to get back? And I think that gives you a better awareness of what's really required.
Dude, look at if you want to ratchet that up even a
Yeah.
little bit more, because there are some MMA athletes that don't make money yet.
Yeah.
Look at basketball, dude. What
Yeah.
happens when a basketball player goes down? They do the whole season,
Yeah.
off season. There's. I think the mentality is a little bit different because there's this ring rust element to fighting or mat rust where people are like, if I'm not in there, if I'm not getting my reps, it's going to be bad because it's not like I'm just going to defend or offend poorly.
Yeah.
Someone's going to punch me in the fucking face
Yeah.
bad if I'm not right
Yeah.
dialed in. So
Yeah.
there's that element to it. But I can't echo your words enough. Like if you're someone who's suffering from an injury, there's one person that you should listen to about timeline, and it's your physical therapist. That's the only person that you should be talking to about when you should return to sport. And I remember when I did this neck thing, I was so fortunate to work with my buddy Jim DBC here in San Diego and Drew, who did all my PT everything. He just like, we had a very honest conversation in the beginning, and I knew that I wasn't going to be getting right back because of the severity, but he was able to help paint the picture. We talked about a timeline. I knew that I could go watch jiu-jitsu, and I knew that in this timeline there was a moment where, provided a certain couple screens were passed with proficiency, that I was going to be able to flow roll. So I could wrap my head around that I was at some point going to be able to go back and at a very low intensity with high level people work through the motions and with zero ego. But that was motivating for me. Yeah. But had I gone and listened to, I'll leave anyone's name out of it, but you go and you listen to people in the academy and they're like, dude, like, come on, get back on the mats, don't be a bitch, whatever. Yeah. There's only one person that's assessing your body. And it's people like you, it's people like Drew, who's doing the diagnostics and then creating the plan to put you back out there safely.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to add to this, just so people know. When it comes to return to sport, timeline of tissue healing is obviously an important criteria, but it's not the only criteria. I'll have people reach out. He's like, I have an injury. How long am I out for? And I was like, tissue healing typically takes a certain amount, but I never return an athlete solely based on time. Once a sufficient amount of time is happening, the next thing is we do some type of objective testing. Now, based on the body part for knees and ACLs, there's like hundreds and thousands of papers on return to sport on what you can do to minimize the risk of re-tear. So, one, has enough time passed? Two, have they passed return to sport? That's super critical, all right? Yeah. The next thing that I include would be sport-specific movements. So it's not you do nothing, go back to full rolling. And I think for me, I'm a sports physical therapist. I understand jiu-jitsu. It sounds like the guy you work with understands jiu-jitsu well enough. We could develop a plan. So it's never just go back to rolling. When someone comes to me, I develop a plan. So right now with this injury, this is what you are cleared to do. And generally, it could be watching class, flow rolling. Generally, what I've been experimenting, next is, and this is a new thing because I've been thinking about this a lot, next is kind of when I would start to incorporate some of these lower intensity eco drills. Following that would be positional training in a position that's low risk. Following that would be rolling from the knees. And then last thing we do is rolling with takedowns. And then we go to competition training. So that's kind of my progression on how I take someone. Now, you were in a tricky spot because you had a neck injury. So what return to sport tests are there for the neck? And unfortunately, there's none that exist. It's based on the provider's understanding of what they want to do. So if let's say like you go to a traditional PT and they're just doing like scapula training for the neck, which is so common, that is not going to prepare you for jiu-jitsu, right? So like, because for jiu-jitsu, your neck needs a good amount of range of motion because someone's going to put you in a position whether you want to or not, right? So these are things that I look at when I'm returning an athlete to sport.
It's one of the reasons why, like, if you're a jiu-jitsu player and you get injured and you have any desire to like see this through, you want to earn your black belt or you want to keep doing this, like, it is imperative that you seek someone out who's knowledgeable in the sport. It really is a difference. It's a difference maker because of that exact reason. If there's not a battery for whatever the thing is, you have to be able to lean on some nuance and like understanding of the sport. And that's actually, it's funny that you say that without knowing what the protocol was, because a lot of it was that. It was testing these, pain-free ranges of motion under certain circumstances and various loading to like, are you ready to go in and do something like flow roll? Because even then, that can go wrong. Absolutely. You can be flow rolling with something, it can go wrong, you can end up on your neck. So there's like, you have to be at certain stages to reintroduce it. And I think the benefit of working with someone like yourself is when you get as a patient, when you get a plan like that back, it creates it's like the first amount of hope that you get from the day the thing happened. Because up until that point, it's all chaos. You have no idea. You don't know if you're I had that moment, right? Am I ever going to be able to train jiu-jitsu again? That was going through my head. And until you get with the PT, you go, oh, wow, put the responsibility in somebody else's hands. You start to paint the picture with your patients and show them like, hey, we're going to do this. It's just going to be, probably a little longer than you expect, but you're going to get back out there. And then you show them through the progressions and the homework and the stuff, and it's diligent. Like, I had to be up every day for my schedule was 5 a.m. I was like doing these correctives. I didn't want to be doing that.
Yeah, of course.
It sucked, man, every day. But like I cared more about getting back to jiu-jitsu than I did about waking up early enough to do the correctives. But without having that knowledge base and people like yourself, people like Heather, people like Drew, or Ziad, who does Kolabate's recovery. Yeah. He's in Costa Mesa. Like, without people like you guys, it's like, what do you do? What do people do? What should they do if they're not in your area or this area? Let's say they're in like, the middle of nowhere in Ohio and they train jiu-jitsu. How do you seek care?
Yeah. Well, so I'll plug myself. So one, I do help people with return to sport.
I was alley-ooping you, dude.
Yeah. So I work with people virtually to clear them. So a lot of times what I'll do is they go to a physical therapist, they get discharged, not ready for sport. I can handle the gap between them. Okay.
Gotcha.
Second thing we do is I do have an online course for physical therapists. So let's say you're a physical therapist, you want to get better understanding of jiu-jitsu. Not every physical therapist is a black belt. So I kind of try to bridge that gap. So if you're working with a jiu-jitsu athlete, you have a little bit better awareness of kind of my thought process, right? And this is a continuing education people get. So physical therapists have to do continuing education yearly, bi-yearly. Well, like, this will give you credit because it's approved. I'm actually working on my second course, even going into far more detail, because the first one was kind of like my foundations, and the second one, like, I specifically go over, like, you have a neck injury, and I kind of like look into jiu-jitsu, neck injuries, what's the demand, what are some of the stuff we do. And I'm doing a pretty deep dive on like technical specifics, such as
Awesome.
someone has a neck injury. What are your low risk, medium risk, high risk techniques? So when you're clearing someone for jiu-jitsu, stay away from this. This is okay. And, I had some ideas and I could give people some suggestions, but like actually writing it out is actually super helpful. And my criteria is going to be based, one, does the movement or position put you at slight risk or elevated risk? Does it lead you vulnerable to some type of counter attack that, like, let's say you come back with a knee, does it put you in a position where they're going to leg lock you? And then three, will this position or technique lead you to a positional scramble? And based on this, I kind of like made my ranking, right? Because already if someone's coming back from an injury, those movement style jiu-jitsu is just inherently going to be more risky because chaos happens. You know what I mean?
That's a really good idea for a product, like just kind of the return to martial arts protocol. Like, what is that for the average practitioner who owns a practice or something, but doesn't have a pulse on it? Maybe they were a field athlete or something like that, but they want to help people get back. That's a good, like, categorizing that and helping them out. 'Cause it is specific, man. I mean, if you don't, if you don't understand the positions, it's guesswork. Like, it's such a risk.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well, Mike, I told you I'd be respectful of your time here, and we're already over. So I really appreciate it. It's always fun chatting with you. In the show notes will be the links to all of your content, your courses, everything like that. So if people are interested or if they want to reach out to you and do a consult or something, dealing with an injury, everything will be there. And other than that, man, we'll have to do this again. People are going to continue to get injured, unfortunately, knock on wood. And so this conversation will always be able to be had.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. Let's do it again for sure. It was fun.
Awesome. Hey, friends, Abe here. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode and sticking around to the very end. If you want to support it, leave a 5-star review on Spotify or check out www.maynideapodcast.com, join the mailing list, and stay up to date on all things The Mayn Idea. From future guests, sponsorship opportunities, products I'm using to help me perform at my best, invites to ask me anything, and any upcoming pertinent information to the show. I cannot do this show without you. It is literally why I show up each week and put these episodes together. So thank you from the bottom of my heart from being part of the community. I hope you have a great day.